All right, Herle Burlyites, welcome back. We're very pleased today with our special guest, Michael Wernick. After a very long career, a lifetime career in the public service, Michael culminated with being the clerk of the Privy Council. For those of you who don't follow these things that closely, that's the number one job in the public service of Canada. That's the top public servant in Canada. Don't be dissuaded by the term clerk. And he, after retiring, subsequently written a book called Governing Canada, A Guide to the Tradecraft of Politics. And as somebody with a BA undergrad, I can tell you that if you're taking political science because you want to be a political science professor, keep doing it. Go ahead and enjoy your degree. If you're taking political science because you want to understand how the government works, drop it all right now and pick up this book, read this book, and you'll have everything that you need and all the things that you will never learn in your political science courses about how the government works. Michael Wernick, we're really pleased to have you here. Thanks for coming. How are you?
Thanks, David, and thanks for that very generous introduction. That means a lot coming from you.
Well, I thought it was pretty interesting. It left me with lots of questions. I hope you don't mind. I'm not going to sort of ask you to rehash the book because I am actually assuming that people that listen to this podcast will read this book. So I just want to leapfrog off some of the things that are in there to talk to you about. But I want to start off with a little bit about you. Mm-hmm. How did you end up in the public service? What's your path to that career?
I could have probably ended up on other paths, probably at law school or living in Toronto, or there are a number of things. Life is full of all kinds of choices and accidents along the way. The short version is I was studying economics at the University of Toronto, and I had a strong pull towards applied and policy sorts of courses. I hung out at the School of Policy Studies at U of T. I was very influenced by a course I took that was full of guest lecturers coming in, ex-ministers and deputy ministers and so on, who would tell their stories. And it gave me a real interest in thinking about going to public service. I was also kind of tired of going to the Robarts Library and working on academic things. I was headed towards a PhD, but I bailed out thinking, well, let me go and work for a couple of years and see how it is, and maybe not live on a student's TA-ship. I applied for a couple of things, one in the Ontario government, one in the federal government. It's the federal government that asked me for an interview back in the spring of 1981. And basically offered me a job at the Department of Finance, an institution you know very well. So I started there writing briefing notes, in the social policy division of the Department of Finance, and literally one thing led to another. And 38 years later, I left the institution.
Had you ever considered the private sector, or were you drawn to policy just right from the beginning?
I think when I was in high school, I was headed for law school. I think my vision, if I had one, was 2 years of poli-sci and economics and apply for law school. And I could have seen myself in law and maybe even in partisan politics. But it's really grad school that turned me towards the public sector. And I just always found the work stimulating, the people interesting. It was close, at a proximity to government and politics. Without some of the risks and hazards, and there's a tradecraft to the public service, which is probably for another book. But I really enjoyed and took some real satisfaction and meaning out of supporting ministers and helping our democracy move along.
You and I share something in common. Which is that we have both been advisors. Mm-hmm. And when you're an advisor, there's a lot of freedom. You're not going to be accountable for the decision. You don't have all the pressures that the decision maker has, etc. But you also aren't making the decision. You give your advice and you walk out of the room, and that person remaining in the room makes the decision about what to do. Over the years, did you find that frustrating? Did you ever wish you were the decider, as George W. Bush would say?
No, I had a lot of respect for the ministers and the cabinet tables and the prime ministers who had that final accountability. And I think I was very comfortable with the role of helping them come to decisions, make sure that they had as much information as possible and the different considerations. I was very aware, though, that a lot of the things that we were considering had consequences. They made a difference in people's lives. When you change immigration policy or childcare policy or jobs policies, these could ripple through families and communities for years to come. So I was certainly conscious that a lot of the decision making, not all of it, of course, was very meaningful to people. And I developed a sense somewhere mid-career about that kind of synergy between advisors and decision makers that you're well aware of.
But surely there were times, Michael, when you were looking at people and going, this person knows way less than I do about this, and they're making a terrible decision.
Well, I mean, not all of my advice was taken. I mean, part of the and some of my advice was wrong. I freely admit I misjudged all kinds of.
Oh no, we never admit that. I'm sorry.
No. Well, let me start with that. I mean, I made mistakes and underestimated risks, and we're all. One of the things I try to get across in the book is that this is a business of human beings, and human beings have, go-to behaviors and styles of learning and taking decisions. The thing about governing the way it feels is that there's never perfect information and there's never enough time. And whether you're minister or cabinet table, it's a business of close enough. We have to make a decision here with imperfect information, an estimate of how this is going to go, and move on, because the next thing's coming along. And a cabinet table in a year might have about 150 to 200 decisions to take in a very limited period of time. So I hope I get across a little bit of how government feels, which is kind of rushed and pressed, and you always wish you had more time and more information, but you won't.
Just one last thing on the public service. How attractive is it to young people? And I guess I think about the financial issues. Something like the Department of Justice, which you said in the book is a good law firm, full of good lawyers. Good lawyers in Toronto make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. How do you attract those kinds of minds to the public service?
Well, it's a big topic. I've always spent a lot of time around universities and recruitment and outreach and trying to, convince people to come in, make a career or spend part of their career. It doesn't have to be a lifelong, thing. Did a lot of recruiting people to come in, spend some time, lend their expertise, and then go back to, to their other. And we need to do more of that. We've never been short of young people who have a sense of serving their country, making a difference. It's actually made a bit of a comeback since 9/11 and since the pandemic. The public institutions and public service matter. The sort of extreme fetish for the private sector seems to have peaked, and so on. And a lot of what the public sector does is interesting and important work. It's some of the best science around. It is some of the most interesting law around. It's some of the most interesting financial analysis. There's some of the most interesting, if you're into cryptography and computer science and algorithms. So in many, many professions, you can offer in the public sector a path, of meaningful work combined with public service. What I take out of your question, though, is we often then, don't pay competitively in some professions, and we stick people in bad buildings with bad technology and say, make the best of it. The private sector model, and people admonish the public sector to be more like the private sector, spends a lot of time on training and learning and development and make sure that people have good IT and so on. And I'd like the public sector to be more like the private sector. And to be more competitive in some professions and some niches, we should have a more flexible, kind of compensation arrangements. Just compensation in general. It's not a bad bargain in the sense that there are defined benefit pensions and coverages, which a lot of self-employed people don't have. And there's a degree of job security in some sense, but in a lot of places, it is a sacrifice of foregone income. To get back to ministers, I mean, it's a problem for prime ministers and campaign teams as well to convince people to take a walk of life that they have a career in and progress. And a lot of people coming into politics, they take a pay cut in order to serve their country. Some of them, it's the best job they'll ever have, but it's quite a variety. So, but the call to serve your country and make a difference, I think, is a common motivator for a lot of public servants, for the kind of people that go into political staff offices, and for the overwhelming bulk of the politicians themselves. That serving your country, making a difference, really is the big recruiting draw, not any of the other issues.
I would have always thought that government was the place you would go to make a difference. Martin, who had a life in business before and had been in the NGO sector as well, he always said to me, you can do more good in one day in government than you can in years and years and years outside of it. And so I always thought of it that way. And then, Catherine McKenna said that she was leaving the government in order to be able to focus more on climate change. And I was like, my God, where can you do more for climate change than in the government of Canada? Mm-hmm. So I'm again just sort of asking whether people see government these days as a place to go into to make positive change in society, or whether they think there's better places to do that than government right now.
I think there are many ways to make a difference, and I have a lot of respect for people that do it as advocates, in other walks of life. I mean, it still remains the fact that there are hundreds of associations and hundreds of paid lobbyists and advocates and NGOs and journalists and pundits and everybody trying to exert some influence on the 30 or 40 people that will be sworn into cabinet later today. So obviously they make a difference. They are the ones, they're 38 million Canadians, only, 1 in a million gets to be a minister. And one of the things I try to get across in the book is that everybody in that room matters, because you have a chance not only to push your own initiatives, but to comment and weigh in on everybody else's. And you can add ambition, you can throw cold water, you can speak out for your region, you can bring consideration. So every minister matters. The fact that it all happens behind closed doors, away from public sight, I think has led to a lot of misconceptions about cabinet government. But in fact, there are real opportunities. There are frustrations that come with it too. I mean, I'm not, not denying, your question. It's a slog, and you always, you win some, you lose some, and it's a wearying kind of life. And a lot of people find after 4, 5, 6 years that they don't want to pay the price anymore.
We've been talking about the idiom "use it or lose it" the last little while. It's generally a truth in life. Think about aerobic conditioning, speaking another language, your vacation time. But when it comes to investing in spectrum to digitally connect Canadians, especially rural Canadians, our presenting sponsor Telus believes it should be a rock-solid principle. Here's a quick refresher. Spectrum is the radio waves that make your cell phone, GPS systems, and Wi-Fi work. Important stuff that helps you live. The federal government licenses spectrum to companies who are expected to use it to provide service. Telus is using their spectrum all over rural Canada. In Wetaskiwin, expanded digital connectivity has allowed the self-proclaimed smallest city in Alberta to stay competitive throughout COVID-19. That means people can successfully run their businesses, access education and healthcare, so they can stay and thrive in Wetaskiwin. But that is not happening in way too many other rural communities in Canada. Their spectrum is controlled by regional carriers who think it's a better idea to squat on it and then resell it for millions in profit than actually use it to improve people's lives. The adjective regional does not mean small. These are multi-billion-dollar companies who get billions in government spectrum subsidies. And the fact is, they deploy less than 20% of the rural spectrum they hold. It's people who suffer. Telus, on the other hand, has the strongest track record of deploying rural spectrum. Almost 2/3 of theirs is put to use, with more to come. Back to their principle. As a technology leader with a social purpose, Telus believes you should use your spectrum or you should lose it. They are fully committed to doing the work in partnership with governments to help end the digital divide in this country. Go to telus.com/connectingcanada to learn more. How collective is decision making? If I am the Minister of Public Works, how much of a say am I going to get in fiscal policy?
Well, yeah. Most important issues of our time involve clusters of ministers. So climate change, Indigenous reconciliation, negotiating trade with Donald Trump, what to do about China, they're multi-minister things. Relatively straightforward thing about we want to legalize cannabis brought at least 4 ministers into play and so on. Defense procurement would bring the procurement minister and the defense minister, but just about every other minister with a regional economic lens and so on. So there's lots of issues around where ministers can make a difference. Some have, particular roles and do have more influence. The Minister of Finance has final say on resource allocation and tax matters. The Prime Minister has the final say on a whole range of issues. He or she is the prime, is the first. There is this kind of trope that the Prime Minister is all powerful and the rest of ministers are blindly obedient sheep. It's just not the case. You have a zone of influence, and effective ministers use it. And sometimes they have a big impact. Sometimes it's a lot of small decisions along the way. Whether you're an advocate for your part of the country, and being the voice of Southern Nova Scotia, or you bring your life experience as a former refugee or a former soldier or whatever. Every minister brings something to those discussions and can make I borrow the nudge metaphor. You can nudge government along, on many occasions.
But as you said, a big part of your book is talking about the lack of time in government, and how you never have enough time to do all the things that you want. So I presume your answer to my question is going to be no. But do ministers get to sit around and talk and debate issues that are outside of their area of jurisdiction? Or if you're a minister, and I'm actually asking, Michael, because I don't know, and I'm not sort of starting to see if this government's different than any other. I'm just trying to figure out, when something goes to cabinet, is it already cooked up with the relevant minister and the PMO, and it's presented to cabinet effectively for ratification? Or do they come and they say, here's what we're thinking about, what do you think?
It's a bit of both and in between. No two cabinet meetings are exactly the same. No, it's a really good question. One of the things the Prime Minister will do is set up, the sort of due diligence system of cabinet committees. And, in setting them up, you send signals about how you want issues to be considered. You put particular groups together. And there's a lot of working through, I describe it as due diligence. You work the politics, you work the public policy, you work the implementation issues, and you can bring issues to a point where they've largely been worked through and they can come to the cabinet table and basically be approved and ratified with minimal discussion. That's misinterpreted sometimes as cabinet doesn't, matter. Those committee discussions or meetings offline between a cluster of ministers. A minister will come and talk to the Minister of Finance or talk to colleagues or go to the Wednesday morning BC caucus and so on. So, and there's also the interaction with caucus MPs. So there's a lot of deliberation and discussion and back and forth. When things come to cabinet, there are probably only 1 or 2 items that you can fit in for a more deliberative discussion. I mean, it's simple arithmetic. If every minister weighs in for 3 minutes, you've used up almost 90 minutes, right? So, but big issues, they can even spill over into more than one meeting. I mean, something as complicated as, carbon pricing, medical assistance in dying, which was a very personal issue for a lot of people. It took more than one meeting to work its way through. or cabinet's keeping an eye on something like the trade negotiations on NAFTA and giving feedback to the lead minister and so on. So, sometimes the transactional items can go through very quickly. That doesn't mean there wasn't, cabinet attention to them at the committee stage.
But if you're a minister, I guess you're telling me you got to pick your spots. If you're going to wade into something that isn't in your area, you're not going to do that on every issue.
Yeah, you can wear out your welcome.
Have an opinion on every issue.
I think that's probably true of anybody who participates in a board or a committee or meetings. That guy who talks too much about every issue and doesn't come to the point loses influence, and that's true at the cabinet table.
Right. Can I talk to you about Diane, Indian and Northern Affairs? You spent 8 years there?
Yes, I was from early 2006 until the summer of 2014, and it went through and a couple of name changes along the way. So, yeah,
I know, and I've got the current one wrong, and it's 2 departments and all that. But unfortunately, I still know it as Diane. But where would you say we are after 5 years or 6 years of Trudeau government, which has this as a stated priority? Where do you think we are on this path to what is now called reconciliation? It feels choppy.
It's a big issue. You have to sort of zoom back a little bit and see the trajectory that, every government makes a difference along the way. We can talk about Mr. Chrétien's contributions, very newsworthy this week. Mr. Martin made a huge difference. Mr. Harper made a huge difference. Each prime minister will try to, comes to the importance of Indigenous issues and tries to make a difference. That's what I've seen all of them try to do. And they have their own sense about how to go about it. The current government can speak for itself. I think their commitment is quite sincere about trying to make a difference. And this is even before the shocking events of 2020 and the discovery of the graves and so on. And they made a very significant financial commitment. Over the course of 4 budgets, I think it'll come out to about $20 billion in net new expenditures on infrastructure and services, which will clearly make a difference. I certainly could have used some of that money when I was at the department in leaner times. What they haven't been as successful at is some of the structural, issues underneath in terms of governance and economic development and some of the long drivers, that would make a difference. One of the things that's missed by people in the Indigenous space is we tend to focus on reserve First Nations communities, and only a few of them at that. And I think one of the more interesting things about the next 10 years is the urban Indigenous populations that are growing up in Ottawa and Montreal and Edmonton and Winnipeg. We'll see in the census data next year, about half of Indigenous Canada lives in our cities and towns, and how the reconciliation is going to work its way through those communities as well.
So we can agree, I think, that the government appears very sincere in its efforts, despite the odd symbolic error along the way. And you're right, a lot of money and progress we can see. They got trashed for boil water advisories in the election for not having eliminated all of them, but they eliminated a hell of a lot of them, and various other things. Yet Indigenous leadership and the Indigenous population seem unimpressed with this government. What's the disconnect?
Well, I think that's about the complex world of Indigenous politics, and I think there's a natural tension between the government as the crown and as the funder and Indigenous leadership across the community. There's always a divide in Indigenous politics between pragmatists and fundamentalists. Some people want to work with the government of the day, and some people find being oppositional more productive. I could say the same thing about provincial premiers, I guess. And it's a very diverse leadership. You're talking about 600 communities and about 50, regional organizations and about 80 tribal councils. it's constantly changing, turning over, as is, politics in on the other side of the table, so to speak. So I remember Stephen Harper, it's the Crown First Nations gathering of January 2012, when there was a very solid, positive relationship with First Nations organizations, with National Chief Atleo. There was a gathering and so on, and it all deteriorated very quickly over the next couple of years. So, there's a kind of an ebb and flow to these things. A lot of it has to do with personality and politics, as it does in non-Indigenous issues. So.
The way most of us were brought up, it's not polite to talk about your income. But most of us aren't publicly traded companies. Publicly traded companies have to talk about their bank accounts, and regularly. Shareholders have the right to know a company's income down to the penny, and what the top executives make and how the company did relative to past performances. That way, they can make informed decisions on whether to hold stock, buy more, or sell. Well, our sponsor, CN, is one of the biggest publicly traded companies in Canada. And last Thursday, it reported its financial results for the third quarter of the year. And as it turns out, CN did pretty well. Revenues were up impressively, and the market's judgment came quickly. CN's share price rose almost 9% by day's end. I've talked here before about CN's philosophy. It is, of course, committed to delivering a good return to its investors and top-notch service to its customers. But it also believes in patiently making investments in safety, in technology, and in capacity that in turn make it the railway of the future. CN's philosophy is one of growth. Its tracks span Canada and the United States. As the fragility of foreign supply chains becomes ever clearer, CN is betting that markets and governments will increasingly depend on rock-solid shippers and trade enablers like, CN. But CN also wants its investors to know it is not complacent. Quite the opposite. The company recently launched a strategic plan designed to deliver immediate shareholder value and make the railway even more competitive in the months and years ahead. It has set sensible spending and earning targets for 2022 and is on the way to achieving them. Last week's Q3 reporting was a day of good news. There will be more. When Paul Martin was doing Kelowna, the Kelowna Accord, he talked to me a lot about the importance of the process of getting there. Not just the results and the content of the Accord, but the, pretty extended, deliberative, consultative process, Fed, Prov, Indigenous, that led to it. Is that partly what we're lacking right now, is bringing along consensus, or is that not possible in this circumstance? Or it's one of these irresolvable questions between sort of results and relationships. I think you need both. I'd quickly say that's true of all kinds of communities of interest and stakeholders and whatnot, that modern government doesn't just cook up something in an office tower, announce it, and say, here, this is good for you. Every community expects to be involved and engaged in decisions that affect them. And that's part of the art of modern governance for everybody. It's particularly important for Indigenous peoples, given they have particular standing in our Constitution. They have acknowledged Aboriginal and treaty rights. There are duties to consult them, which apply, and so on. So, and the Supreme Court, through over 20 decisions, has laid down doctrines of honor of the Crown and duty to consult, and so on. So there's a particular issue about how to engage in Indigenous peoples. At the end of the day, though, you often come to a place where you have to say, have we consulted enough? Is it time to call it and make a decision? And that's always a tough thing to do. We're going to go ahead with people who disagree with the result never feel they've been consulted enough.
Yes, and that's true in non-Indigenous communities. It's certainly true in Indigenous communities. And the politics of it are, if somebody says yes to a settlement or an agreement or supports a government bill, there will be somebody else who runs against them, saying you're the Joey Smallwood of our community. And the last time I looked at the numbers, the chiefs that signed agreements with the government of Canada, almost 3/4 were defeated in the next election. So it takes a lot of courage to come to yes. And we've seen that with, the National Chief Atleo and other Indigenous politicians paying a very high price for taking the more pragmatic, collaborative approach. It's easier politics to run against the Crown and against Ottawa. Again, some premiers find that too.
Despite the best of intentions, sometimes things just fall into the maw of government and disappear. And my example would be murdered and missing Indigenous women. What the hell happened there? I mean, I can't believe the government didn't want to get to the bottom of that. They've got no interest in protecting anybody or protecting the truth. I presume the government's very sincere about wanting to get to the bottom of that, and yet the whole process has collapsed into nothing. How does that happen?
There was a push to have an inquiry that the Harper government decided not to pursue, that they said, we don't need the inquiry, we can start working on the solutions without the inquiry, which goes to your point about the process mattered to a lot of people. There actually was an inquiry, and there is a report, and there's a long set of recommendations, a lot of them aimed at the courts, the policing system, administration of justice, and so on. It was a very broad, sweeping report that had a kind of we need to fix society as well kind of flavor to it. I haven't checked in on it lately, but I think a lot of it has been acted on. And there are real challenges, particularly in law enforcement and policing and taking these matters seriously. But I mean, we just saw over the last month how much media frenzy and attention can be devoted to one missing white woman, in the United States, where they have the same issue of hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous women going missing. And Secretary Holland is trying to make that an issue in the United States and draw attention to it. So, it's an ongoing challenge in terms of the systemic tilt in our justice system.
Right. I'm just going to flit around from issue to issue now because there's so much to talk about. And
hopefully we'll talk about the book too at some point.
This is all about the book. This is all about the book. What? You were involved in the Charlottetown Accord process.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in the public opinion research business, and so I've seen a lot of what Canadians agree on, where there's consensus, where there isn't consensus, how different regions and different people see the country. What did you learn about Canada through the Charlottetown Accord process?
Oh, that was one of the formative experiences of my professional and personal career. My bad joke about it is I actually chaired the drafting committee of the Charlottetown Accord, which was sent to every Canadian household. So there were 11 million copies of my work printed. I didn't make any copyright money off of it. But Charlottetown, I think, is a warning sign about using referenda to decide complex issues. We saw that in other countries and so on. There aren't a lot of things that lend themselves to yes, no. And then when you do that, all of the different reasons for saying no come together. So, I mean, the striking thing about Charlottetown was the no side included, such diverse characters as Pierre Trudeau, Jacques Parizeau, and Preston Manning, all arguing against it, but for completely different reasons. And it was a much harder sell to say this is a good compromise that we should move on from. And I think that would, if we ever get to fundamental changes in our institutions of government, Senate reform, proportional representation, and others, they almost inevitably will have to go to referendum. In terms of and then you're going to have the same phenomenon is that referendums are tilted towards rejection.
I have the same opinion about referendums, and I have the same opinion about proportional representation, because what Charlottetown and other things have said to me is that there are some pretty fundamental concepts about Canada that Canadians don't agree on.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can get by day to day and not care, and everybody can get along, and we can have a functioning country. But if you want to sit down and have a discussion about whether Canada is a compact of French and English, two founding peoples, or whether it is a multicultural country, you're going to have quite a lengthy debate, and a pretty hostile one, because in Quebec, people don't think that's a debatable proposition, and Ukrainians in Saskatchewan don't think it is either. So I think this is a country that could have too much democracy.
Well, I think if I can quote, somebody we both know, sometimes in politics and policy, ambiguity is your best friend. And a little fuzziness is what allows you to keep moving forward. You just agree to disagree. And, we navigated ourselves into a space in Meech Lake and Charlottetown where people were looking for great precision about, distinct society and the nature of Quebec's relationship with the rest of the country. I sat through quite a few meetings about the Canada Clause in the Charlottetown Accord. And as you rightly say, there are very different visions of this country. And I think what we learned from it is we don't need to resolve that in order to continue to be a successful country. What's more important is not that kind of clarity and precision, that would appeal to the political scientists and the op-ed writers, but to keep living together, making decisions together, and making for a better country.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's very well said. SNC Lavalin, I have only one question. I think you'll be pleased. I have only one question. I've seen other interviews you've done, and you've had more than one question. I only have one. And that is, why were you making that call to Jody Wilson-Raybould instead of somebody from the PMO? How often does the clerk get involved in that kind of disciplinary role in the government?
Well, I mean, that wasn't particularly a disciplinary role. I did have a sharp conversation with the same minister.
Disciplinary, not by punishment, but by trying to bring her into the consensus, right?
Well, I did have conversations with ministers from time to time, where I'd reach out and say, we need to talk, or, I had various conversations with ministers. As I said at the committee, and, I don't want to rehash all the details, we basically come to the end of the session. It was just, we were all about to take a Christmas break. There was a cabinet meeting, a retreat style meeting scheduled for Sherbrooke the second week of January. I was doing my thing, which is running through lists of what's on the table, left to do, heading into the last year of the government. What are some of the issues out there? And this was one of them. And I was trying to find out where she was coming from, with a sense of how this was likely to play out in the early part of the session. Conversations that week, we started to think about, well, how are we going to use the January cabinet retreat? It's probably the last one we're going to have. So it was in that kind of context, which of course disappears in hindsight.
Right. But would that normally be a call that would come from the PMO? Like, the Prime Minister wants you to get on board with this.
Well, I'm not in a position to know who spoke to whom when, and there would have been conversations from PMO to a chief of staff, for example, as a prelude to talking to a minister. Those relationships. I have less insight into how PMO manages ministers and ministers' offices. I saw some of it up close.
So that wouldn't have been coordinated then.
I think it was on the to-do list, frankly, of Katie and Jerry and I as we came to the end of the session, that we knew that it was a bubbling issue for sure. That fall, it was one of a range of issues, that we were trying to see, how are they going to unfold in the new year.
Since Confederation, owning a home has been part of the Canadian dream. For most people, that dream is much more than just a monthly mortgage payment. A home is where we create our fondest memories and where we can truly be ourselves. For too many, especially young adults, that reality is out of reach, and it's getting worse. The good news is our original sponsor, the Ontario Real Estate Association, OREA for short, has a plan to save the Canadian dream of home ownership. It includes lowering costs for first-time buyers, ending money laundering in the real estate market, and cutting years of red tape that is standing in the way of more affordable homes for families. The OREA plan will lay the foundation for a future where all people can find a place to call home. When we support the dreams of all of us who want to own a home, we're building healthier families, stronger communities, and a safer, more secure future for all. Read their plan at orea.com/affordable homes. One of the things that I thought was, most important in your book is the relationship between the public service and the political level and how those two things interact, what their roles are. So public servants work for and support the agenda of the elected politicians. What's the challenge function when the public service thinks the government is off on the wrong track? How does the public service deal with that, and how strongly do they challenge their political masters?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have been, accused of denigrating the policy function of the public service in some of my previous interviews, and I guess I'm not doing a good job of getting across. So let me take another go at it. I mean, a lot of the basic policy drivers of what government is going to do and whether it's going to do it come from democratic politics. The public service doesn't, say we should have carbon pricing, we should legalize cannabis, we should, what they do. I mean, a lot of those major sort of decisions come from political platforms and from governments deciding this is where we're going to go. Or they have a sense of, we want to toughen our relationship with China, or we want to, increase readiness, of the Ontario economy for autonomous vehicles. So it's more of a back and forth and a dialogue. Where the public service excels is working through that dense middle ground of, well, how are we going to get there? There's costing, there's legal issues, there's intergovernmental issues. You have to pay attention to international agreements and covenants. A lot of issues around implementation. So turning things into actionable choices. We could do this or we could do that, and turning them then into implementable laws, policies, programs, and regulations. That's something that the public service does that outside groups don't do. But generating, what government should do, there are lots of academics and stakeholders and think tanks and pundits and opposition politicians and others that create an agenda for government moving forward. Governments are often trying to move forward, the electoral platform they just put to Canadians, and that's entirely what they should be doing in a democracy. They're trying to signal where they would take the country if reelected, and that's entirely legitimate. And then they get shocks and surprises, whether it's a global pandemic or a financial crisis or a terrorist attack, and responsiveness to shocks and surprises is part of governing as well.
I always think back to an example, Michael, of the Department of Justice. When I was a consultant to the Department of Justice for a number of years in the 90s and early 2000s, and this political versus policy thing would regularly occur in that department. And I'll give you an example. Tremendous political pressure to reform the Young Offenders Act. And the government feels a need to respond to that pressure because it was bringing the general criminal law system into some disrepute. The department had a very strong view about how young offenders should be treated and fought hard against what the government was trying to do. And it was a difficult process. They were not note takers. They were like, this is wrong and you shouldn't do this and you're sending the wrong signal and this is bad policy. It was a real challenge function. And they disagreed, and they made it clear that they disagreed, and they didn't make it easy to get it done. That's their job, right?
Well, up to a point, certainly putting, your arguments and your case forward. At some point, you have to yield to, the democratic accountabilities of cabinet and parliament. There are people that are steeped in areas of public policy. People that work at the Pearson Building in Foreign Affairs have a very strong view about the Middle East or about a particular part of the world or so on. And I think it's important to make those arguments and to test them and to go back and forth, often with the political staff or with the minister. But at the end of the day, you yield and defer to the who's the accountable decision maker. At some point, you don't want to be seen as completely resistant and non-compliant. That's not the role of public service in my view in our democracy. We see what happens down south when people start to believe there's a deep state, operating in its own interest, pushing its own views. And I don't think that's the case in Canada, but some of that rhetoric has started to show up in Canada. The power structure, the elite, pursuing its own view of the world. I think at the end of the day, what's important, I say this at the end of the book, is we get to choose the 338 people who make these decisions.
Just when you went into the elite and the power structure, I thought you were talking about the Rogers boardroom saga there for a second.
Well, that's a whole other episode about corporate governance, but anyway.
It sure is. So how did you feel when Munir Sheikh resigned as the head of StatsCan rather than implement the census changes?
Well, I think that's part of the part of the compact is, it's true for ministers and staffers, and it's certainly true for senior public servants that you can end up in a place where it's no longer possible to do your job. And if if your disagreement with the government is so fundamental, then you should resign. And I respect Munir for having made that choice.
Okay. All right. What is it that you cared about? So you were in this job where you were one of the most powerful people in Canada, and you were one of the most senior advisors to the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has an agenda of things he cares about. Cabinet has an agenda. What are the things that motivate you, Michael? What are the issues that really you care about?
Well, I came into the job conscious of being asked to help a very new green rookie Prime Minister and cabinet find their way and get some traction. And I was one of the old hands of the town. And I was, so a lot of what I cared about was the governance issues that I talk about in the book, about helping them sort of come to their way of governing and deciding. That was important to me. I took the role as head of the public service seriously and did use every opportunity to advocate with the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, and the Secretary of the Treasury Board for things that I thought were important to, building up the capabilities of the public service and modernizing it. So, I used a lot of nudge at budget meetings and other places. I pushed hard for e-cabinet, so that cabinet now can meet securely from anywhere, through secure networks and so on. So in terms of policy issues, I spent a lot of time in intergovernmental affairs on national unity, and I spent a lot of time on Indigenous affairs. So I would certainly perk up for conversations around those issues. But one of the real privileges of working at PCO and being in those positions is, in the course of a month, you'd be exposed to everything from agriculture to veterans to, deployments in the Middle East. And I just learned a great deal about all kinds of areas and about our country.
Right. So what are the aspects of a good clerk, Michael? What is if your advice to prime ministers now, picking a clerk of the Privy Council, what are you looking for in that person? Are you looking for somebody that can run the operation? Are you looking for somebody that's got good relations with the public service? Are you looking for somebody that's the smartest person you've ever met? What are you looking for?
Oh, all of the above, obviously, but no, seriously, I think that there are generic characteristics of the job in terms of having a degree of experience, enjoying some respect from the rest of the senior public service community, being able to adapt to the learning style and decision-making style of the prime minister, and so on, finding a way to deal with all kinds of diverse personalities and so on. There are sort of competencies and skill sets, if I can use that kind of jargon. But I think each pair bond is different because of the context of governing. I mean, I think helping new government, Stephen Harper in the first days or Justin Trudeau in the first days, is quite different than helping somebody in their third mandate who is very, very clear on how they're going to go about their job and may have a particular sort of agenda. I think we had the right clerk for a global financial crisis and economic meltdown. We had a different clerk when national unity, was the dominant issue. So it may sound a bit evasive, but I think each choice is a bit of a pair bond exercise, and they're all going to end up in a sort of different relationship. The core to it, I guess, is having that mutual trust and just the ability to work together and have candid conversations. Somebody in another interview sort of described it as keeping the PM happy. Well, no, you and I know that's not possible. I've been, dressed down and chewed out by every minister and every prime minister I've ever worked for. You tell them what they need to hear sometimes, even if it's uncomfortable and unpleasant. And but you want to have that kind of mutual respect and mutual trust, which doesn't come automatically. It takes time to build. By going through things together, it's. I think that in a sense, it's not that different from the relationship any deputy would have with a minister, and I try to get that across in the book. You need to find some mutual trust and a way of working together. Ministers come in all kinds of different varieties. We've had, I think, 60 brand new ministers in the last 10 years. Today's shuffle could bring that to 70. They're very diverse human beings. And the job of the deputy is to find a way to work with the minister, not the other way around.
Right. Terrific. One last thing. In writing this book, in thinking about all these things, putting your thoughts together, you must have reflected on things that don't work well. What would be a priority for reform in the way our government works?
Well, I try to make it very clear in the book. This isn't, how things ought to be. It's not a prescription for reform. There's plenty of op-ed writers and political scientists to do that. I think that what we're going to need in government, and I would include the political system and the public service, is a degree of agility and nimbleness and the ability to move quickly and take decisions, faster based on imperfect information. The pace of the world just seems to get faster. I was reading a book about Mackenzie King last month, and it's just a foreign planet. The amount of time they had to think about things, and I think even in the last 20
years. Even the 1990s feels like it. When we were sitting around for months at CMOs debating budgets, it feels like a lifetime ago in terms of the news cycle and the speed.
And this is where my sort of grumpy old man lament would be the kind of reactivity to social media and trying to win a Twitter war in the afternoon. And I think that the discipline of keeping your eye on your medium and longer term goals, you have to be good at tactics as a shield to get there. But if you try to govern through issue management one day at a time, then suddenly your mandate's up, and what have you accomplished?
Right. Sir, thank you for taking the time to do this and have this conversation with us. Thank you for your service to Canada, and for your lifetime of commitment. And I'm sure you've got another act in you. So I'll be watching carefully for what it is. But in the meantime, thank you for sharing your time with our listeners today. Very interesting, very insightful. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all you Herle Burlyites for listening. And, of course, thank you, Michael Wernick. Take care. Till next week.
Thanks for your interest, and thanks for a great conversation. Cheers.
Wait a second. Buy this book, Governing Canada, A Guide to the Tradecraft of Politics. I would show you the book, but I'm living in the country, in the bush, and the book hasn't made it out here yet. There we go. There's a copy of it. I read it online. Beautiful. There you go.
Chapters, Amazon, and UBC Press has a buy local button.
Absolutely. And as I said, it should put every political science department in the country out of business. Take care, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.